Hello, companions. Thank you so much for joining us today for Frank Spotnitz Storytelling Masterclass. Frank is one of the most sought after showrunners, and he's also, to be honest, one of the nicest people I've met in the industry. We're also going to bring in some special guest writers throughout this masterclass today, and I'll introduce them in a little bit. And I think they're really going to help uplift and round out the conversation. Frank started off his career on The X-Files and went on to write some other incredible films and shows, including Amazon Prime's The Man in the High Castle, Netflix's Medici, and many others. For those that may be less familiar with the X-Files writers' room, it is incredibly famous and has had several alums to go on to create some culture-changing shows. So beyond Frank shows like 24, and Homeland, Breaking Bad, and much, much more. But what I find so inspiring, and this is something that he says on his website, I was late to find my path in life, but I feel incredibly fortunate that I did. So if any of you think you may be a little bit too late to start, I hope Frank and this event today might inspire you. And that's what we're going to learn about today. Some inspirational stories and definitely some practical techniques that Frank has learned, created, and evolved over his career. So let's welcome Frank Spotnitz.
Thank you very much. Very kind. Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Awesome, Frank. Well, I'm always fascinated by, I guess, origin stories, or just wanted to explore a little bit and give folks a bit of framing of your perspective, I guess, when you write. You were born in the U.S. Army camp in Japan, which is about southwest of Tokyo, about an hour or so.
Mm-hmm.
You've had an interesting and varied life. You've lived in multiple countries. You later lived in Paris. You live in London today. How has traveling and living around the world shaped your writing and your career and your perspectives?
Well, like you said, I was born, on an army base in Japan, and then moved around a lot of my life, from Colorado to Pennsylvania to Arizona, and then, went to school in Los Angeles, and then worked in the Midwest, in New York and Paris. And so moving around kind of feels natural to me. And I think looking back on it, having moved so much as a child, I got used to the feeling of being an outsider, always having to be the new kid starting over again. And to the point that actually feels natural and comfortable for me. So I guess that's a pretty good position for a writer to be in. You're sort of the group, but apart from the group, and looking at it from the outside.
Yeah, and we talked about this previous in the past. A lot of your shows, you write for international broadcasters as well as American ones, and can you speak to, I guess, the different stories that just, are outside of the United States that you find interesting?
Well, it's interesting, when I left the United States to come work originally in the UK in 2010, I began to get a perspective on my own culture that I didn't really have before. And you start to realize the different storytelling traditions and preferences that different cultures have. So now I've written, with the French, with the Germans, with the Italians, with Canadians, as well as the British and obviously the Americans. And they're all slightly different perspectives, which has been really not only fascinating, but really enriching for me as a person and as a storyteller, to kind of understand the different ways that people receive information and how different things move them, and different sort of cultural biases you encounter. I think it was really, really important for me when I did Man in the High Castle, because that was sort of, looking at an alternate version of the United States. And I think the time I spent in Germany really made me look at the whole issue of, intolerance and prejudice in a different light, because I really came to see that it's something that can affect any people, not just, the German people in the 1930s. And I, that's a conviction I carry with me now today. And obviously it seems sadly more obvious that that's true today than it did, when I wrote Man in the High Castle.
Oh, awesome. Well, we'll definitely explore that, and I think in a little bit we're going to hopefully break down some technical scenes from that as well, and I think it'd be really exciting for everyone. And I guess another kind of question is about your earlier days. Your first career was as a journalist, but you know you were Hollywood bound deep down, and I think there's a lot of people today listening in, and people have been emailing me questions, and really it's around what helped you decide to take that leap, that dare to follow your dream. I think a lot of people have that kind of struggle themselves.
So I always wanted to write for movies and TV. I mean, as a kid, I was an obsessive consumer of everything. I was an indiscriminate watcher. I watched everything on TV you could imagine, went to the movies. I'd go to the movie theater and sit in the same movie again and again. I'd watch it 3 or 4 times in a row. And I always wanted to do it. But then I got to UCLA and I lost my confidence. And I just thought, this is too hard. I'm not going to make it. It's way too competitive. And I'd had a really inspiring journalism teacher. And I ended up becoming editor of the school paper. And I ended up being a reporter for 7 years, which was a great experience in many ways. And I covered fires and politics and trials and everything you can possibly imagine. But after 7 years of doing it, I just realized I don't love this enough to do this the rest of my life. And so at the age of 28, I moved back to Los Angeles, and then I went to the American Film Institute to get a screenwriting degree. And that was 2 years where I really got to think about movies and storytelling and what it is I had to say as a writer. And it was a really important period in my life. And then miraculously, I was lucky enough to get the X-Files as my first job out of film school.
Do you feel like going to film school at a later age, I mean, late 20s and presumably finishing around 30s, it helped you? Like you were a much more mature student, or actually there were lots of other mature students as well at the time?
No, it definitely helped me because, well, first of all, being a reporter is a fantastic preparation for doing this. You have to learn to organize your thoughts, to write quickly, to synthesize information. Chris Carter, the creator of the X-Files, had also been a journalist before becoming a TV writer. So it's and I also think it gave me a few years to kind of grow up and get some life experience. And then I got out, I was 31 when I graduated, and it's like, I can't mess around. It's like,
Right.
I'm not getting any younger. My 20s are gone. And I have to say, again, it was luck that I got the X-Files. And it just so happened when I got the X-Files that it was the right show for me. It was exactly the kind of show I would have watched as a kid. Mm-hmm. And I was very, very green, in every way, as a writer, as a producer. I didn't understand the politics of being on a TV staff at all, and nearly got myself in a lot of trouble for being so naive at that point, in my career. But I connected with the show like right away and in a very deep way. And I was really fortunate because Chris Carter saw that in me. And, I rose up really fast. So I started out as a staff writer, which is the lowest entry level you could have. And after 3 years, I jumped up to executive producer and ended up becoming the president of Chris's company. And we did, 3 other TV shows together, Millennium and Harsh Realm and The Lone Gunman, and 2 movies. So it was really, it was a late arrival, but it was a really good one.
Oh, we're gonna dive deep into all of that as well. But can you maybe just quickly describe, the X-Files writers' room had so many fantastic writers, and at the time, I'm sure, like nobody would have known, what shows they would actually end up creating. But did you know you were working with these all-stars, and what did that feel like?
It was very intimidating. Mm-hmm. I came in, early in the second season. There were a lot of dead bodies around. I mean, most of the writers, if you look at the credits, those early seasons, most of the writers are like one episode and gone. Like it was a very tough sink or swim kind of environment. But I knew I was on an extraordinary show. I mean, I knew it was a great show, and it was growing in popularity already. And you could see, the talent, certainly, Morgan and Wong, astonishing how strong they were. and Howard Gordon, and Alex Gons had already left when I came on the staff. And then, Chris Carter, of course, who was so driven and ambitious and really insisted that you give it your all. He would really tolerate nothing less than your best. And he demanded that of everybody who worked on that show. And I think that really had a positive effect, ultimately on all of us. And then, late in the second season, Darren Morgan had been there before I was, but he didn't write his first episode until late in the second season. And it was just stunning. It was like, who are you? What have you been doing all year? What the hell is this? Humbug was his first episode. And I remember he gave me the script to read and I was just like floored, especially since it was a comedy, which was incredibly daring. And then, of course, John Scheiben came and then Vince Gilligan, who, again, it was just, an astonishing talent right from the beginning. Just read his pages and it was just a joy. So, yeah, I think I did know. I was in an extraordinary situation. And I think what most impressed me was the work ethic all of us had. And yes, it was because Chris insisted upon it, but we did it. We were there, we lived and breathed that show. And we never stopped doing our best, not till the very end. And that's what I'm most proud of.
I think that's one thing, you said you were very fortunate. You had a lucky break. I think I read on your website as well. You talked about, this almost idea of fortune or luck, but I know by reputation, you're one of the hardest workers. Your work ethic is incredible. What are some of those things that I suppose tips that you can have to make that fortune happen? Because I can't imagine it's dumb luck, right?
Well, this is what I say to people is you don't get to control when you're going to get your break. It could come tomorrow or in 10 years or 2 years. It's out of your hands. So what you need to do is take the time you have now to get ready so that when the break arrives, you can capitalize on it, right? And so, and this is the hardest part of your career before you get your break. Because at that point, there are no deadlines. There's nobody paying you. There's nobody validating you, telling you are a writer. It gets, honestly, in many ways, much easier once you get hired, because then it's like, okay, there's deadlines. This is real. People are going to see this. I'd better do it right. But in that early part of your career, before you've even got an agent, a lot of people are like, am I really a writer? There's that kind of fear and insecurity. And my advice is, set aside that fear and just dive into your work and just do as much preparation as you can so that when the break arrives, you're ready for it.
Awesome. Well, we have a couple of guest writers who are going to help round out the conversation. Each of them have produced, they've shipped, and they've made great work. And hopefully they can add, some perspective as well in terms of hitting deadlines or I guess when they first started their own self-imposed deadline. So the first guest we have is Colleen Evanson. She is currently the head writer on Disney Plus's Monsters at Work, and also TV writer on DuckTales, DC Superhero Girls, and Kid Cosmic. Colleen? Hey!
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think actually everyone actually heard it on YouTube already, but you had already broken in and you're in the X-Files office there. And
yes. Yeah, I snuck in. Don't tell anybody. The feds are going to come get me at any moment. But yeah, for now, I'll just squatters' rights.
Yeah, exactly. Our second guest is Molly Flatt. She is the author of The Charmed Life of Alex Moore. And also Molly wrote an absolutely personal, wonderful tearjerker of a piece for us around the X-Files last year. Welcome, Molly Flatt.
Hi, I'm joining you from a crypt, looking like a vampire. So,
and our last guest is AJ Black. He is a film critic. He is the author of The Cinematic Connery, a biography of Sean Connery. And he's a regular contributor of The Companion with some of the best research articles, particularly around the X-Files. AJ Black, welcome.
Good evening, everyone.
How is how is everyone feeling from a X-Files fan perspective? So less so Frank, but maybe we can throw some flowers to Frank. Maybe Colleen, we'll start with you. We could actually visually see those flowers manifested.
I've literally given myself away. No, it's funny because I often tell people the reason I pursued a career in TV was the X-Files. I was completely obsessed with it as a kid and even today. In fact, I actually even did a Vine series before the revival came back, where I recapped every single episode in 6 seconds with action figures and very silly paper props. It is available on YouTube for anybody who wants to check it out, called The X-Files Abridged. Self-plug.
It's genius. You should definitely check it out. I recommend it.
Yeah, I love the show. It's crazy how in 6 seconds it sounds insane. But yeah, that's kind of the reason I got into TV. And like Frank, I kind of stumbled around. Initially, I just kind of pursued wanting to make TV. I went to college for TV production. I had no idea I wanted to write. And in fact, actually, I was a member of the X-Files official fan club, another nerd alert. And I used to order the scripts before I had any idea I wanted to write, and I would read them and study them. So it was kind of like subconsciously there. And then I got my start as an assistant. And then I worked my way up through that and realized I think I wanted to write, and took that like assistant route to get there. But the X-Files was always kind of like the bar to try to work on something that was as like interesting, thoughtful, and ideally a hit.
And Molly, how about yourself? Can you share some of your X-Files fandom and love here as well?
I mean, this is a dangerous invitation, Lawrence. Frank, how embarrassed do you want to be? I mean, I just want to lick the camera right now. No, I was genuinely, it was that right thing at the right time. You know, when I was 13, 14, it blasted into my consciousness, and I'd always been this secretive little geek who loved like Ursula Le Guin and Susan Cooper, and all these authors that kind of no one else at my like private girls' school in Oxford was really into. But I had one friend who was also an X-Files fan, and it was on really late for us. And so, you know, special permission from our parents to watch it. And I was just saying to the other guys backstage, we'd then fax each other our little mini reviews, because it was the closest we could get to like a feeling that we were in the future and that we were part of this super cool world of America with big cars and like coffee. That's so cool, drinking coffee outside and like portable cups. What was that about? So no, the X-Files, do you know what? For me, the X-Files, I was always a little sci-fi geek, but what I loved about it was the characters. Here was this, and I think it was such a genre exploding event, really, because it was so character driven, and I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be Mulder or Scully or sleep with both of them or be, do you know what I mean? I used to cosplay. I was Mulder because I was 6 foot and flat chested, and my friend was like 5 foot and had big tits. So I was always Mulder, and I loved it. But it was this, I was utterly in love with these people, with their weaknesses and their strengths, and they were so real. And I think, you know, in my writing, similarly, I really committed to finishing my first novel when I turned 28. So before then, you know, I worked in tech. I didn't think writing was at all an option for me. Like, how do you make a living out of that? I didn't know anyone who was a writer. I didn't think it was a viable thing. You know, you had to get a corporate job and make money, especially as a woman. You had to prove that you could play the game and be independent. But for me, I always wrote stories, and what haunted me was, could I ever create characters that people love this much? And like, yeah, crazy shit happening to them, amazing. And I love the fact that you were allowed to be a grown-up and still love that exuberant imagination, which some people seem to think was like something you should move on from post being a kid and loving Narnia. Like suddenly you should just really like literary novels about people having dinner in West London. But for me, that the genius of it was taking all that thrill and all that joy and having these characters who I'm still totally obsessed by them. They are so real to me. I'm going to start crying. So I think.
Yeah. And AJ, how about yourself? Why X-Files?
How do I top that?
Yeah.
I feel much the same, really, as everyone else. It was the show. When I was younger, it was Star Trek was the show that I really loved throughout the late 1980s into the 1990s. And I remember we used to get the X-Files on BBC Two in the UK, and I think it was One Breath, the episode One Breath in season 2 that by Morgan and Wong that just blew my mind. And I remember from that point on, I was obsessively curating friends who shared my X-Files love at school, because I was about 13, 14 then myself, and collecting the VHS tapes, because we used to have VHS tapes in the UK where we wouldn't get the whole series released. We'd get like 2-part. We'd get Endgame and Colony. So one of Frank's great episodes in one file, and just become obsessed from there on. And it's never gone away. You know, I mean, I've cycled through many things over the years that I've enjoyed, many movies, many TV shows, but there is the X-Files, and then there is everything else, genuinely. And it will always be that way. So then when the show was about to be revived in 2016, I decided to start a podcast, which thankfully is still going, called The Xcast. And that's where the love of this show just carries on. And it's created a whole community around that podcast of X-Files fans, which is still going today. And I will keep it going for as long as possible until it comes back. Maybe.
Those were, thank you for sharing all those stories. So let's get back into it. Let's get back into work ethic and getting started and writing. So Frank, you talked about how, you know, there's this very high bar that Chris had set. I'm assuming everyone who then made it, you know, within the writer's room that continued on after just, you know, I suppose some that maybe had only one episode. Can you describe, really, it's not even just starting, right? Because all these writers have started. It's like, when is it good to great? You know, how do you get to a really great script or something really wonderful? What kind of energy or what kind of endurance or what kind of, I don't know, experience does it really require to really just like get to that next level?
Well, that's a good question, because I mean, I have to be honest and say sometimes, you know, episodes that we thought were going to be great ended up not being so great. And then other episodes that we didn't realize were going to be great turned out to be great. So there's sort of a lot of intuition plays into it. You know, you have your intellectual and emotional mind, but then you also have this mysterious subconscious factor that, you know, you're not always aware of until after you're done, you know, until after you see the show, you know, you edited it or the dailies have come and now you realize, oh, this is really special. But I think, you know, one of the benefits of the show was the writer's room system, and that we had, you know, a half dozen writers that were sitting there in that room with cards like the cards I have behind me here and a cork board. And we were working on these stories, you know, 9, 10, 12 hours a day, 5, 6 days a week. Making them as good as we could, and, you know, until we ran out of time and then had to start writing scripts. And, you know, that's why I talk about the work ethic. It's like, you know, I really believe most of this is rigor and dedication and perseverance. Some of it is talent, but most of it is the work ethic that allows you to shine that talent. You know, I think of myself and I think, like, you know, maybe 5% of my success is because of whatever talent I have, but I've worked so hard to polish that talent and to make it shine as brightly as I can, so that, you know, I'm not, you know, my shortcomings aren't as noticeable as I'm aware of my shortcomings, but I'm hoping that I'm working so hard and making it as good as I can so that, you know, people enjoy it. And it's a mysterious thing, because, you know, some of the shows that I've enjoyed working on the most haven't been the most successful, and others that I didn't enjoy as much ended up being really successful. So you know, I think if we, the creators of these things, knew the answer ourselves, we would never fail. But, you know, it's just too complicated a thing, storytelling. There's too many variables for anybody to really predict what's going to work or not. So I just believe in doing my best and taking satisfaction in everything I do and knowing that I've done the best I possibly could.
Do you know when you feel like you've done your best? Like, is there
Oh
a
yes.
moment? Yeah, that feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, I really think it's a funny paradox, but the harder you work every day, the more you're determined to leave nothing in the well, like you've given it your all and you've really tried to make this great, the more energy you have the next day to get up and do it again. And conversely, if you ever start saying, that's good enough, well, that'll do, it starts to sort of sap your creative soul. And then actually it gets harder the next day to get up and do it again. So I've really, trained myself to just always try to do my best. And, even then you're not always going to succeed, but it's very easy in this business to get distracted. There's a lot of noise. You might look around and see somebody else is making more money than you are, or winning more awards, or getting better ratings or reviews. And, none of that matters if you're not doing good work, right? And if you are doing good work, well, then you're more likely to get all those other things, the money and the reviews and the ratings and so on. So, just stay focused on the work. That's what it's about. That's what's going to sustain you.
Oh, that's awesome. Colleen, I mean, from your experience, you mentioned you start off as an assistant and that's the route you take.
Yeah.
What kind of work ethic do you put in, like at every single level for yourself and, obviously becoming a head writer?
Yeah, I mean, it's not too dissimilar from what Frank was talking about. I really love TV and wanted to be a part of it. So even though when I started, I didn't quite know what hat I wanted to wear. Sometimes I thought I was going to be a producer. Sometimes I was like, well, writing seems fun. But I would make sure that I was in early, like first in, first out, or last out kind of thing. I was always trying to like there's times that as an assistant, you're just sitting around. Like, I'm just going to be honest. Sometimes you're just waiting for the phone to ring or waiting for someone to call you back. And I was always trying to find scripts that once I realized I wanted to write, first I was reading them just kind of for fun, and then was like, can I do this? And then I started to kind of study them in a different way. It's like, yes, I enjoyed watching the X-Files, but then all of a sudden when I started to break down like what happens in the teaser and how does Act 1 and what is building in Act 2, before I even really had the language of what was going on, sitting at that desk, so in some ways being an assistant and being able to work on certain shows, that was my grad school, because I was able to read scripts from what people were working on. There were times I was on phone calls with the showrunners, just listening in and hearing like how they handled notes, how they handled executives, seeing the dynamic and the politics of a writer's room by being just someone quietly taking notes. Like learn, there was so much stuff that I learned that I didn't realize I was learning, that if I knew that I wanted to write right out of school and I got a writing gig, I don't think I would have been successful, because I would not have understood that real life experience of context of what's happening, the machine that you're a part of, and the routes that are available to you. That, much like Frank, I was like in my 30s when I had my first staffing gig. And at that time, it was still scary, but I was like, oh, I'm ready to do this now, because I've been in those rooms. I've heard these notes. I've seen the evolution of scripts from in a room reading the notes like that the writer's assistant would be taking as an executive producer assistant. I'd be reading the room notes every day. Then I'd see what the outlines look like. Then I would see what the first pass would look like. Then I'd see the revised pages that they picked. And it was stuff like that I was paying attention and staying late and like actively asking questions, to where I'll say that I had an assistant job at one point that it was supposed to be a desk job. And I kind of noodled my way into being like, hey, if I forward the phone to my cell, can I come to set with you guys? Can I go to that record session? Can I do this? And they were like, okay. To where a couple months afterwards, they were expecting me to go to all the meetings. Like I was expected to be there. So it was a way, like there's ways of kind of like pushing and seeing how much more you can get involved without being annoying. There's a fine line of that. But that, all those assistant jobs, it can seem like it's front work, but there was so much of that subconsciously and consciously taught me how to do my job well now.
And so that's great. And so Frank, I guess aside from TV, like your experience and Colleen's experience, you've also obviously made films. Is that process the same? I'm assuming you've got a longer period. It's not like a weekly show. Going through that process, does it require even higher stamina, or is it actually the same?
No, I mean, the only two films that I have actually made have been X-Files films, which is kind of cheating.
Right.
And we were really in a rush. So it was not at all like the typical movie development process. But I would say, I often say movies are like a love affair, because you come together with a big group of people and it's short and intense and you may never see them again. Whereas television is more like a marriage. And you really have to invest in those relationships, because if it's a successful marriage, it's going to go on for years. And so you don't want dysfunctions and resentments to build up. So you really have to be a good communicator and collaborator to make it a successful television series.
And Molly, how about you? I mean, from writing a novel, I'm assuming it's much more of a solo or maybe a duo task between you and your editor. And how do you keep motivated and continue in finishing?
Yeah, listening to you guys, I'm just so jealous of the learning from other writers, because I could only learn as a reader, so far. I mean, so absolutely the work ethic. Like, I've always written ever since I was a little kid, and other people were out playing with their friends in the garden, and I'll be upstairs writing my little stories, and I always did that. And, the way I kind of graduated from tech into journalism was I would just write. I would write for free everywhere, and then I would start to get paid a little bit. And I would always have stories on the go. And I used to do a lot of conferences, so I'd be in a lot of amazing places in the world of which I would see nothing, in hotels by myself. And I would sit and write. I would read. I would watch shows that I loved that had incredible writing. I remember one particular incident where I got almost like arrested by a security guard in a airport in Las Vegas, because there used to be this big conference there, and I'd unplugged one of the fruit machines in the airport to plug in my laptop so I could sit there and write while I was waiting for this delayed plane. So write and work, but it's incredibly solitary, especially things like a novel. My first novel took me 7 years to write, because I was doing it around other jobs. And I think that's the thing about novels as well. It's incredibly hard to make a living out of it. So I still have a journalism gig, and I do corporate copywriting, which pays better than anything in actual publishing. And so I'd say, definitely the work ethic. I'm jealous of you guys being able to talk to people other than the people in your head, learn from other writers, but very similar approach. You've got to love the process, because yes, writing is the hardest thing for me is the creative writing, but it's also amazing and such a privilege. I have managed to kind of earn a little bit of time, but also I think, what I found as I got older, and the clincher for me was it went around when I was 28, saying I'm going to finish a novel, because I had all of these half-started things. I was like, no, I'm going to finish from now on for the rest of my life. I'm going to finish consecutive novels, whether any of them get published or not. I was very lucky that the first one got published. Let's see about the second one. But I think also work ethic team with realism, because I would read all of these writing craft books and look at all these videos, and they all seem to involve white middle-class men with wives who could wake up at 5 a.m. and do their morning pages, and then go for a walk with their dog, and then answer their emails, and then work. And it's I've got a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. I work 3 days a week and look after the 3-year-olds on the other 2. Childcare is more expensive than novels earn, and have 2 other jobs. And so for me, I never have had the writer's room experience. If I get a full day, working day, where I can just focus on my novel, it is amazing. The immersion I get, the incredible stuff. But a lot of the time I'm snatching 2 hours here, 2 hours there, and you can do it, and it's okay. And I think I used to get incredibly disheartened that I wasn't a committed enough or a good enough writer, because I've made these life choices to have kids and to try and earn enough money and other things to support it. So, for other writers out there, I'd also just say compassion for the fact that, yes, you need to be insanely committed to make it work, but you can make it work whilst also having other elements in your life. You don't have to be in an ivory tower. I long for an ivory tower.
Yeah. Well, Molly, I hope for you, just like the way Frank talks about how success begets some freedom, and more success and begets more freedom and success. So, hopefully you will be able to get that
and realistically, but also real life helps. There's a bit of me, the bit of me that longs for the ivory tower. I'm also do you know what? Being a mum really helps me be a more mad person, but a more wise person. I've learned so much about myself, so much about psychology. When I am tempted to try and just write and also put the kids in more, I think actually, I really think having to confront life and having to do jobs that aren't always my first choice, and having to sometimes work with different clients and be answerable, they give me stuff to write about. And they keep me an honest and flexible person. Whereas I think I could go down terrible introverted rabbit holes if I didn't have all of those elements in my life. So I also think it's not just a barrier to writing. For me, it's been an amazing thing to actually have all of this stuff to juggle, because it synthesizes, it's rich mulch.
No, it's great. Okay. So we've got this rich, life history. Things are getting thrown at you. Frank's talking about he's lived around the world and seen the experiences, actually seen the American experience through the lens of, say, Europeans and in Asia. So once you have all of that kind of life material, those experiences, let's look at starting to put that together and structuring a story, structuring that into drama, let's say. So Frank, if you could teach us a little bit, at least from your perspective, how do you take all those experiences or these new characters and start to structure this into a story?
Well, let me just say, I think there's two parts to writing. There's sort of the art of writing and the craft of writing. And the art of writing is by far the most important part. It's who you are. It's what's in your soul. It's what you have to say. It's what moves you, what makes you laugh and cry, and your understanding of other people. It's the uniqueness of you and the point of view that only you, of all the people who've ever lived, can give a story. That's the most valuable thing about being a writer. But the other part of it, which is very important, is the craft of writing. And to me, that's like the carpentry of writing. It's how do I structure a story? How do I, structure a scene? How do I write a line of dialogue? It's the mechanics of it. And most writers, when they start out, they have the art, but they're not very good at the craft. And that's why, you tell writers to write as often as you can, because the more you write, the faster your craft will progress, right? If you go to the gym, once a month, it's probably not going to get you very far. But if you go to the gym 3 or 4 or 5 times a week, well, yeah, you're probably going to get a lot stronger. Or if you want to learn another language, if you take a class, once every couple of weeks, you're never going to learn that language. But if you're doing it every day, you'll get quite good at it. And so that's the thing about, people can tell you about writing, but it's only by doing it that you internalize that craft. And so for me, having done this now for 25 years or something, my craft is so much stronger now than when I started out, at the X-Files. And that allows me to access my art more successfully. So I'm one of the people who believes in having tools at your disposal that you can use to ask yourself, am I telling the story well? There's sort of external measurements you can look at. And, you can go, well, I know I'm breaking this rule, or I know my character's not being active, or whatever the measure is, the metric that you're choosing to ignore. But it's still helpful to be aware of these things, especially with something like, visual storytelling or television and movie writing, where there's a very clear, simple set of rules you can look at that help you in structuring and telling your stories.
So, specifically, if we can dive into that, Oh, Frank, can you can hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Like if you go to film school, you oftentimes hear about 3-act structure. You've heard of 5-act structure, you've heard of the hero's journey, and then so on and so on. There's 21 steps and all sorts of different types. Is there any kind of one that you particularly follow? Are they all kind of the same? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'd have a very hard time writing a book about screenwriting because it'd probably only be about 5 or 10 pages long. I really don't have
Right.
a lot of rules, but I mean, the good thing is I can tell you very, very briefly what
Oh,
I
we'd love
think.
to hear it. Yeah, absolutely.
So, the board, which you can see a board there behind me, like in the X-Files, for instance, there was always a teaser and there were 4 acts and there were commercial breaks after the teaser and after each of the acts until the end. And so the teaser would be, let's say, 5 to 7 pages, and each act would be between 10 and 12 pages. And you were aiming for a shooting script of between 52 and 56 pages, something like that. So the thing about a commercial break is that it means that the final scene before the break, this final scene at the end of the teaser or at the end of each act, has to be kind of a mini cliffhanger. It has to be kind of a story hook to induce the viewer to come back, right? Because as a commercial, they might go to the bathroom, they might flip the channel, they might turn off the TV. So you've got to give them a reason to keep watching. So those act breaks are convenient reminders that you'd better be doing things that keep your audience interested in your story. Storytelling is communication, right? I'm a writer because I want to tell you a story. I want you to receive what I'm saying. And so you want to make sure that what you're saying is being received the way you intend. So to me, the simple structure of really just about any movie or TV series is, it begins with an inciting incident, right? And it's here, it's low. Can you see my hand? It's there. Mm-hmm. It's low down. And then the problem grows. As the story goes on, the problem grows. And then finally you reach the climax, which is the end of the story. Then you have the denouement and you're out. It's over. So all stories are like triangles. The stakes rise, climax, out. It's that simple. And so as you're looking at those commercial breaks or act outs, you're looking to make sure you're asking yourself, are the stakes rising? Is the problem growing worse?
And so to clarify and be specific, would you actually think about it as with each commercial break, there is a almost like sharp or exponential kind of rising, or is it much more linear in terms of the stakes being raised?
It's utterly unpredictable because every story is so different. And if it wasn't, it would start to become formulaic and boring for the audience. So, that's sort of the delight of the audience. If you watch the X-Files, over 200 episodes, the delight is, no 2 act outs are the same. You're going to be surprised by what happens, the specifics of every story. But what you can say is true of all of them is that the problem is growing worse, right? Toombs is eating more livers, right? or somebody else has been abducted by an alien. It's like, or Scully has disappeared. Something has happened that has made it worse. If the problem lessens, you're letting the audience off the hook. The audience can take a breath and go, oh, okay, well, I guess things are fine. So it's like, I think when I watch a really good movie or TV show, within the first 90 seconds or so, I am gripped or I'm not. I'm emotionally engaged or I'm not. And if I'm emotionally engaged, and that's what I'm trying to do as a storyteller, is engage your emotions, then I want to stay emotionally engaged throughout the entire episode of the entire movie. And so I'm looking to write scenes that kind of keep you in that spell and never let it drop. And the ideal story to me, kind of storytelling I like, and the reason I think I responded to the X-Files so much, is that it's really emotionally gripping. It's really entertaining. But after it's over, you realize it was about something, that it was asking an interesting question, that it made you think. And that's the TV, and those are the movies that, decades after I first saw them, they're still in my mind. There's an awful lot of TV and movies that I consume and throw away. But the kind of TV and movies that I want to make are the things that you don't throw away, that stay with you because they said something that really made you think.
And so, because these days you're writing a lot more for streamers like The Man in the High Castle, etc. It doesn't change then, or are there actually an evolution to that kind of escalation?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't change that. That's still true whether it's an episode of The X-Files or Man in the High Castle or Medici or anything else. What's changed in the new TV environment is that this is serial storytelling, right? It's one narrative, and the characters are moving through time and space, and they will never pass that point in their lives again, right? That wasn't The X-Files. The X-Files, it was more like short stories or variations on the same, theme again and again and again. And you could take, 15 or 16 of the episodes of The X-Files in any given season and shuffle them, and it really wouldn't matter very much, right? Except for the mythology episodes. They were standalone episodes. But that's not what's in vogue anymore. Now we do these shows it's one narrative. And so you're moving through characters' lives. And what you have to do is make sure that you are not going so fast that you skip over something important, because you'll never have a chance to go through that moment in their lives again, right? The moment before they got married, or before their father died, or before their sister got killed, or whatever it is. You've got to mine all the emotional and dramatic material very carefully, because you only get to do it once.
Colleen, is it similar with what you're writing as well? That kind of same structure, that escalation, and I know some of the stuff that you're writing is for a younger audience as well.
Yeah. It's very interesting because people are confused sometimes when I'm like, oh, I was obsessed with The X-Files, but I write comedy, and they're like, what? Like, you don't have a sci-fi sample? I'm like, no, I have comedy stuff. But I think the story is still good. Like, you still want the bones of a story to be good. And then I just throw more jokes on top of it. That's kind of all it is. But to Frank's point too, there were two different kind of stories that exist now. Ones that are more network, that have kind of that story engine that you kind of rinse and repeat, and you can go through with the characters and kind of catch episodes and not miss anything. But the more trend is serialized. So like DuckTales that I worked on, it was weirdly like an X-Files setup where we had standalones, but we had a mythology through each season that we were like building on. With Monsters that I'm working on now, I'm working with people that worked on Disney movies and in the Pixar movie space. And we are playing with an IP that is a movie franchise. So we are telling a movie story in 10 episodes. However, there is that trick to make sure that each episode can kind of be a little self-contained, but then have that cliffhanger that brings you to want to keep watching. Because I'm not trying to get you to watch 2 hours. I'm now trying to get you to watch like 4 hours, and you're hoping that you can hook people. But it's the same kind of thing where you want to make sure you're hooking people in, but not only do you have to do the dramatic elements, but then it's also like, okay, but is it funny?
Yeah.
I've worked within like light dramedy shows, and at the time I was telling people I wanted to work in comedy, and they were like, don't do that, it's so much harder, just stay in drama. And they're both hard, but I think the philosophy behind each, you still just want to tell a good story and make sure the characters are engaged, regardless of if that scene is going to make you cry or make you laugh.
Awesome. Well, now that we know a little bit about the philosophy behind it, should we get into some of the practicalities? Let's actually see come to life. And so we're going to switch camera angles real quickly. And Frank, if you don't mind showing us the cards and I guess where it kind of also came from, and how you I guess develop it and use it today. That'd be awesome.
Well, so these are the cards here. It's a lined card, and we use only Sharpie pens. I'm not being paid by the manufacturer, but it has to be a Sharpie pen, black Sharpie pen, and then push pens. And this is a system that, I think it was Morgan and Wong who brought it to the X-Files, but, I can't swear to that. I think it came from Stephen J. Cannell Productions. They've done shows for them before coming to the X-Files. But the beauty of the cards is that you can write very simply the beats of a scene, and you can see it, the whole room, all of your collaborators can see the story together. And you can see your whole story in one place. And the reason you write cards instead of doing on a whiteboard is because you're going to end up ripping up the cards because you're going to think of better ideas, or you're going to move them around because you realize, oh, I need a scene in front of this, or this shouldn't be in act 1, it should be in act 2. But what you're doing is you're building the story brick by brick. And you're writing down what these cards are meant to capture is how a scene begins, how a scene ends, and most importantly, the thing many writers forget is what's the conflict in that scene, because that's what's going to give the scene life. And the conflict could be two people arguing, or it could be somebody who's running late for the train. There's all kinds of conflicts, but there has to be some kind of dramatic tension. And if you forget that, then when you get to the script, you're trying to write it, you're like, well, this scene is lifeless. What do I do? So what I have here, if I can switch camera angles, this is a board very much like the boards we had on the X-Files, and that now most shows in Hollywood and writers' rooms around the world use a system just like this. And as you can see, I've got cards for the teaser, the first act, the second act, the third act, and the fourth act. Now, you could just have 5 acts or 4 acts, to do whatever structure you want. And now that I'm in a streaming environment writing for, Amazon or Netflix, where there are no commercial breaks, but I still use the act structures as reminders to myself to make sure that the stakes are rising, to make sure that I've got narrative interest for the audience. And I may choose to not worry about it because there's no commercial break, but at least I want to know. It's one of those metrics, like I talked about before, that I can look at my story and ask myself questions about it. So what I've done here is I've carded the teaser, if you will, the first 4 pages of the Man in the High Castle pilot episode. And I'm just going to do this very quickly. If you saw the episode, it doesn't matter, but if you did, this may come back to you. But this is going to tell you what the scenes are and what the beats of it were that I needed to remember. And if I was in a writer's room, the other writers would be able to follow the story with me and argue about the scenes and make sure we're telling the best version of the story we can. So it begins with a patriotic newsreel, our proud land, right? And at the beginning, you don't know whether this newsreel is just an American propaganda newsreel. It looks like you're in the early 60s, late 50s, and it's a very industrious, happy America. And our character Joe sits in the movie theater with the newsreels playing. Another man sits beside him. Now we're moving on to the next card. This is still the same scene. Another man sits beside him and slips Joe a card. And now as Joe exits, the newsreel ends and we see an American Nazi flag. And that's the first time you realize, uh-oh, something is wrong, right? Now this is another scene. Joe goes out and he runs across the street and we reveal that he's in New York and it's Times Square. Only it's Nazi Times Square. There's a swastika and there's all these Nazi slogans on all the billboards and neon signs. And now from there, we cut to close Juliana, who's our other main character. And now we see that she's in a dojo and she's facing this big beefy man. She's much smaller than he is, but she flips him. And now we see the other men in the dojo are watching and they're dismayed. They don't really like that this young girl is beating up this much bigger guy. All except for one, this younger boy, Donnie, younger, sweet Japanese kid. Juliana flips this other guy again and again. And finally, the instructor says she's won. And the moral that he's teaching that is, thematically important to our story is that even though she's smaller, it's her skill. That's more important than strength, which is not a fascist ideal, right? So for me, this is one of my themes in the show. It's about humanity living in an inhumane world. And the idea that strength is not the most important value is an anti-fascist idea. So now the class is over and Donnie approaches Juliana admires her necklace, which her boyfriend Frank has made, which is going to be important later. We're going to meet Frank. And he asks her to tea, which she declines. That's also going to be important later. She says next time. And now Juliana exits, and we realize that she's in San Francisco, only it's a San Francisco that is occupied by the Imperial Japanese. It's not a San Francisco that we've ever seen before. So you can see the narrative flow of the first 4 pages of that episode. And in a writer's room, we would argue about these cards and rewrite them and keep revising the story and move them around until we ran out of time, with the goal of making the story as perfect as we can before we then write the treatment, which is sort of a prose version of the board. It's usually about 8 to 10 single-spaced pages. And then that treatment you would give to the studio. This is in the old days, still works that way in some places. And they would give you notes. You'd address those notes and then give it to the network, who give you notes, and then you'd go to script. It's a very sort of organized, I would say, industrial process, because it comes from the days of when we used to do 24 episodes of television a year, and you needed these things to work. You needed these scripts to be successful, because you had to churn out a new one every 8 business days, which, if you think about it, and think about like a show like The X-Files, how challenging that show was. And every 8 business days, there was a new script. And this is the process that we used to ensure their quality.
Would you really only have a day then? If you're churning out a script every 8 days, like a day to do these cards and debate it, is that how much time, or even less time? Or
No, I think on average, it ends up being about 2 weeks.
Right.
But what was happening is we were working on multiple stories at once, and writers would go off with their board out of the writer's room, put more cards up, then come back into the board. And while they're out of the room, we're working on another story. So on average, I would say they took about 2 weeks. I mean, sometimes in desperation, a few days. But it depended on where you were in the season.
And some folks outline. This is a step that kind of comes after outlining, or do you once you get feedback?
This is before the outline. So
the outlines.
That's why you write the cards so neatly. And there's only 3 lines, and everybody has to be able to see it and argue about it. It's the narrative structure of the story. And you can look at it and you can ask yourself questions like I was saying before: are the stakes rising? Is the problem growing worse? You can say, is my protagonist active? That was a big thing in X-Files, but it's really true of all storytelling. In X-Files, are Mulder and Scully driving the story forward? The secret of that show was, in the best episodes, they were both half right. But in all the episodes, it was their differing points of view that drove the investigation forward. That's why they were the series leads. And then you can look and say, has anything scary happened in this act? In the X-Files, we used to call them boos, like a ghost jumping out and going boo. And we'd look at the act and we go, well, there's no boos in this act. That's a problem. This is supposed to be a scary show. And so, if you didn't have a boo somewhere in the middle of the act and at the end of the act, you probably had a problem. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it was just another measure. You could look at your story and go, is this going to work? Or you might look and realize you've got 3 scenes in a row of people talking in rooms. Is that right? Is that what you want? Maybe you want to move that foot chase and put it between the 2 scenes, things like that. And then you write the treatment or the outline. And then after that's been approved, then you write the script. And I've met writers who go, well, that sounds horrible. I would hate that. All the fun has been taken out because, you figured everything out on the board. What's left for me to do in the script? Well, the answer is everything is left for you to do in the script. This is just a roadmap. When you get to the script, I guarantee you, if you're doing it right, you're going to find 1,000 things that, no matter how carefully you plotted the board, you didn't realize until you got to the script. But this is a roadmap that makes it far more likely you're going to reach your destination. You have so much more confidence as you go into the script because you have a plan. But, almost always you end up finding ways to vary from the plan when you get to script. And that's the joy of doing it.
So from a very practical standpoint, I mean, you have quite a big board. That was just the teaser section, and you were getting, to the end of that. Is there I guess what I'm trying to ask is, like oftentimes when you're writing a script, one page, 1 minute, is it kind of similar like this with the cards, or actually the cards could be, anything?
Usually, you will have 2 rows of cards per act. So for 10 to 12 pages, you'll usually have 2 rows of cards per act. I really recommend all of you follow the Twitter feed of my friend Tom Schnauz, who wrote for X-Files and Lone Gunmen, and that has written brilliant episodes of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. But if you look at his Twitter feed, he shows these exact same cards from episodes of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and he compares them to script pages. And you can look at that, and you can also see, you can watch the episodes and see how the cards translated to script translated to finished product.
Oh, that's awesome. And earlier we asked Colleen if you kind of had the same process. I think you were saying there's like a digitized version that you use as well.
Yeah, we used in the before times, before the pandemic, we used to have a kind of a note card system, not too dissimilar from Frank. And there was the group of us in the room, and we would talk about, okay, let's make sure we're hitting the setup, the catalyst, the driver, and we would kind of have our first go. We would go across and do very simple cards like that. It would be like, Huey finds a thing. He debates it with Scrooge. Like, it was very small because you want to be able to move it around. But then once we decided, okay, that's what the skeleton is, then we started to put the meat on the bones together, and we'd go through each scene and kind of figure out, okay, what's happening in the scene, who's in it, what's some dialogue. And to Frank's point, I know there are some writers that feel like, oh, well, you're taking it out. But we had to, you're taking away my ability to do whatever I want. But we also had a 25 episode order. So it was like, we need to get this done. So do you want to do this together and get it done faster? Or do you want to be in a room by yourself pulling your hair out? And it was so much faster. And the script, I will say, to add to what Frank is saying, when you do the work to figure out the skeleton, and then everybody's kind of deciding and agreeing on what all the pieces should be, when you get to script, it's so much faster to write the script. And then you get to focus on the fun lines, the fun little twists. You're not kind of like, why isn't act 2 working? I think that I actually find it's a lot more of an enjoyable ability to write it when you know the structure works. Because I've worked on shows that blew past a story break in half a day. And then they were like, here you go, figure it out. And I was like, dude, act 2 is not figured out. And then lo and behold, it keeps going through rewrites and rewrites and rewrites. And the last thing I ever want to do is try to find it on the page. I want to be able to look back and make sure the whole structure works before you get into all the details, because then you fall in love with stuff. And then it makes some people have a hard time cutting something that they're like, oh, but I spent so long figuring out this joke and I really love this. And it's like, yeah, but it doesn't fundamentally work. So it's doing it that way, even though it might feel like it's a lot of hard work to figure it all out up front, the reward of doing it is so much easier to me. It will still evolve. Everything will change. Each draft will change. But having everybody being on the same page with what that structure is, then you don't have a writer come back and all of a sudden act 3 is completely different. And you're like, wait, that's not what we decided.
Yeah.
And if you have more episodes coming, you're like, oh my God, now we have to rewrite this in a day. So it just makes it a lot more manageable to do all the hard work together.
Frank, does that ever happen where you get to the treatment that's been approved and you get to the script and you actually do run into issues like what Colin is saying? Do you ever go back? Is there an opportunity to go back to the cards and you have to go through that process again?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly happens from time to time. It certainly happened from time to time on the X-Files, but it's far less likely to happen. And that's what this process was designed to do. It's sort of quality control. It's sort of minimizing the odds that you're going to be left with an act or a script that simply doesn't work. And the great thing about a writer's room is that if I'm sitting by myself trying to figure out a story problem, I could be stuck for hours or days. If I'm in a writer's room with 5 other people, probably within a few minutes, I'm going to get a whole bunch of solutions. And odds are one of them is going to be better than something I would have thought of by myself. And if you're in a writer's room like I was as a beginning writer, you know, there were people in that room who'd been writing for 20 years. And I'm sitting there with them for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, week after week after week. And I'm learning from their experience. And I'm seeing how they solve story problems or how they think about character and dialogue and plotting. It was like a second film school for me. And I think it's really hard, like Molly was saying, like if you're not in a writer's room, if you don't have that mentorship, it's like you're paid to learn. It's built-in mentorship. It's much tougher to advance. So that's why this is one of my favorite parts of the job is being in the writer's room with other writers, having all these smart people focused on the same problems together.
And maybe one last question around the cards, especially with working on much more like longer serialized stories these days. Do your story cards, like at the end of your episode, kind of have to match up to the next writer's storyboards, or how does that kind of collaboration work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the other great thing about this process is that, you know, when I do Man in the High Castle or Medici or any of the serialized dramas that I do now, all the writers are in the room together. So it may have my name on it or somebody else's name on it, but we've all worked on the story together. So if it's your turn, Lawrence, to write episode 4, you know every nuance of every beat that has preceded episode 4. So you're not going to repeat an action beat or a character moment or misunderstand. It's like, you know it. You have ownership over the whole show, not just your episode. So again, it's, you know, now that we're in the era of 8 episodes or 6 episodes or 10 episodes, there's a lot of people who don't need writers' rooms or showrunners who run shows different ways. But I still think there's a really good argument for it. I just think there's a rigor to this process that makes it more likely you're going to succeed.
Yeah. Do any of the guests have any questions for Frank on cards and structure or anything? I've been asking all the questions, so AJ, yes, of course.
Thank you. I've got one. It's fascinating, Frank, what you're talking about. It's brilliant. And you mentioned theme when you were talking about the teaser and you were picking through it. Is that something, I've often read writers talking about how the theme of the episode, it emerges as you write and as you go on. But do you go into an episode like the one you described or any of the others you've written with an idea of what you want to get out of this in terms of what you want it to say? Or does that evolve as you develop the corkboard, the treatment, etc.? Or is it a mixture of both?
Not surprisingly, you've asked a great question. I often have no idea what the theme is of what I'm writing. I often write purely because this really interests me, and for some reason I really want to tell this story. And sometimes I don't know what the theme of it was until, you know, it's on TV and I go, oh, that's what that was about. You know, I don't know sometimes. It did strike me, you know, while I was doing the X-Files all the years ago, that, you know, the episodes that tended to be the stronger episodes, they were clearly about something. You know, whether we knew it at the time we were writing it or not, it was clear in retrospect that there was an idea percolating beneath the narrative. So I've been writing for a while now, so I do try, if I can, to identify the themes that I'm writing about, because it makes the story development process a lot easier. And in the case of Man in the High Castle, I was working from a book that really didn't have a narrative, you know, that did not have a linear, certainly not a TV narrative. And in order to figure out how to adapt it, I asked myself very consciously, what's this book about? What's the theme of this book? And my answer was, it's about how do you maintain your humanity in an inhumane world. And so knowing that, I could then structure my story around scenes and dilemmas that were about that. And it just made it much easier for me to realize these are the kinds of situations that are, you know, relevant to this narrative, and these are the ones that are less relevant.
Awesome. And Molly or Colleen, do you have any questions? Or AJ, if you have another question as well.
Well, about just story structure, or
Yeah.
I have one about story structure, I guess. So I've always loved, novels are quite different. You've got a different context in terms of attention, but actually increasingly, I think it's more relevant that if you're going to keep people hooked, you need really compelling beats, and also it's fun as a writer. I think it's just better to raise the stakes and have tasty things. So I've always been very influenced, read a lot around these story structure, the screenwriting story structures, I guess, the kind of John Truby stuff, and the Joseph Campbell mythic journey and how it feeds into screenwriting. There's some great writers like John Yorke and William Storr who kind of translate that for broader works and for novels and things. But recently I've been kind of thinking, there's been a lot of talk in the publishing industry about how this is a very Western archetype. So this idea of the individual hero, and here's the high stakes, and that these stories all have this quite predictable shape, and that there's increasing kind of attention being paid to other cultures and other narratives that maybe center more of a collective heroism or less of a kind of linear vision of history. I just wanted to, have you ever played with narrative structure? Because I haven't. I'm not brave enough. I'm probably not skilled enough, and I'm so embedded in this Western narrative structure, from watching these shows and reading these books my whole life, that I find it very hard to pull myself away and very dissatisfying to work with a structure that doesn't like hit those obvious structures and those beats. Have you ever experimented with a different narrative structure to that, to that blueprint that we all find, find so compelling?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question as well. I mean, I think the basics of Western dramaturgy probably go back to Aristotle, and I think it's true. We're all sort of speaking in it. It's a common cultural discourse we're in, and the values, the dramatic values, are consistent. And for better or worse, I work in a very commercial medium. It costs tens of millions of dollars to make these shows, and so no, I really haven't varied from that. It's like my job is to engage and entertain you and make you think, and I can't imagine I'd be very successful at breaking the rules entirely. I mean, I have seen movies from other cultures that I absolutely love that don't operate this way, but they're not speaking to this culture. They're speaking to another culture. And so I enjoy them, and I'm stimulated by them, but I don't think they're particularly commercial. So, and I don't, that doesn't mean that they're not as good or better. It just means they're not commercial. And nobody's going to fund what I do unless it gets, people sitting in front of the TV.
I'm actually curious just about knowing that a bunch of people who are probably watching this maybe don't have a writer's room at their disposal when they're breaking like a pilot or just a sample. When you do get stuck, if there are tricks when you're writing a pilot that you do for yourself to try to like get out of your head.
Great question. I talk to myself on paper. I sort of type into my computer like a stream of consciousness, like the argument I'm having with myself about what's wrong. And it's sort of like, I don't have a psychiatrist around, so I'm going to be my own, talking cure. I'm going to like write everything down. And I find that by doing that, I'll end up like realizing what my problem is. Or often I will go to bed at night and ask myself, solve this problem. And when I wake up in the morning, honestly, most of the time, my subconscious mind has solved it overnight. But the other thing, and I say this to people who, aren't professionally paid yet, if you can find other writers, other people who are in your position, film school is a great place to do that, or a film writing class, but it could be anything. It could be an online group. But other people who are your peers, who are in the same place you are, who will read your material and you will read theirs, that's incredibly valuable. That's more valuable than the professors, really, is having that other group of people, because it strengthens your skills of analysis, reading their material, seeing what's not working, and then having them read your material, as attentive readers. It's like I was saying before, storytelling is about communication. I'm telling you something and I have an intention. Please tell me how you're receiving it, especially in the early part of your career when your craft might not be as strong as it's going to be later. You're going to find there's sort of, craft mistakes you're making that other people can help you identify.
I'd absolutely second that. And I think for as that person who exactly has to be their own therapist, I find, just like you think, that actually also writing stuff out allows you to almost split in two. You can kind of be writing and talking to yourself. And that thing about writers group, 100%. So I spent my savings at that point in 28, when I decided I was going to finish novels, I spent my savings on like a 6-month writers course, writing a novel course. What I learned was brilliant, but actually what was priceless was coming out with this group of people who, we still kind of meet, not as regularly as we did, and a lot of it was online, but also finding a diverse group of people, because I think it's so, I was very attracted towards the obvious person in the group who wrote similar to me, who had similar influences in terms of pop culture, in terms of books. But also what has been brilliant for me is having this group of, we've got an 80-year-old, we've got a girl in her 20s, we've got people who are all different backgrounds and professions and life experiences. And those unexpected takes on stuff I've written is brilliant. It can kind of make me see potential in different areas that I would never have discovered. So I'd absolutely reiterate that guy about find people different to you to like talk about stuff.
So Frank, would you be doing cards in the question that Colleen's asking and following up with that? Would you, even if you're just by yourself, you're also soloing and doing the cards and going through that whole process, and I guess asking, if you can, other people to read those cards as well? Or is it more like later towards the script stages, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time I am in a collaborative environment. I am using the board and the cards. The only time I don't necessarily use the cards is if I'm writing a pilot episode by myself and there's nobody else I'm collaborating with, then I might not. But that's only, I have to say, the last several years where I found I don't need to do that if I'm not communicating the story to anybody anymore, because I think the rhythms now are kind of deeply ingrained in my mind. But if I'm writing with even just one writing partner, I'll still use the cards so that we can talk about the story together before we write the outline or the treatment.
Colleen, do you find that the same if you're writing by yourself, or do you always still go back to the cards? And
I mean, I don't have 25 years experience yet, so I still kind of use it as like bumpers on the bowling lane. I'm kind of like, okay, let me just make sure I have all the pieces that I need, because again, there's sometimes, at least the way my brain, I'll hear when I start to click and hear the characters talking in a scene, I'm like, oh, okay, that works. And sometimes I might get ahead of myself in like, oh, I like that bantery thing, and I have to kind of step back out and make sure, like, but am I moving the plot forward? Can I make this, instead of a talky scene, can it be an action? There's stuff like that I still kind of want to make sure I can see the forest for the trees before I go to town on witty banter or something that you easily get lost in, like, wait, what? This is funny, but what is this about?
Kind of curveball question, AJ, is that something that you can take to when it comes to writing an article, a long read, or even structuring a podcast? Is there something like that from a cards perspective?
I think with any, I mainly write nonfiction right now, and I think every good piece of nonfiction is telling a story ultimately, and I think you have to try and structure it as to what's your beginning, what's your middle, and what's your end. When you're trying to figure out what the theme of the article is, what the point is you're trying to make, what the ultimate effect you want to have on the reader, and it is absolutely thinking in those terms and not letting the idea carry you down too many rabbit holes or too many unexpected places that might take you away from what you're actually trying to say. And that can be really difficult to do, especially when you get an idea that runs off in that direction. You think, oh, that's a great idea. You have to sort of rein it in. And I think actually, as everyone was talking, I was wondering, Frank, in terms of craft, because you talked earlier about craft being so important, and you've talked about all of these methods that you still use that go back years. Do you find that with time you've really been able to refine a lot of this, and have you brought other aspects in terms of being able even quicker to get to the core of these, creating these stories, and not being thrown off or going down all of these places? Because I think we're talking a lot about craft, and I think it'd be really interesting to know where you're coming from there.
Yeah, honestly, yes, the craft part has become much, much easier for me now, because I kind of have this sort of toolkit in my head of solutions to story problems, or to scene problems, or to dialogue issues. But what has not gotten any harder, any easier at all, is the art. Is, what do I have to say? Why is this interesting? Why is this going to move people? Why are people going to care about the story? Why is this a great story? I always tell writers, I teach writing at a program in Berlin called Serial Eyes. I've been teaching this my 10th year. And I always tell them, aim so high when you write something. Like, this is going to be the greatest TV show ever. Really, you've got to aim so high, because if you're aiming way up there, you're probably going to land like right here. You're never actually going to hit the target you're aiming for. You're going to land lower than that. But, if you aim for like the greatest thing ever, then maybe it'll be pretty good. But if you're aiming at just, this is going to be okay, well, guess where you're going to end up? It's probably going to be pretty mediocre. And especially a lot of writers at the beginning of their career, they'll go, well, but it's better than that. That's terrible. It's better than that. Well, that's not the standard you want your career to be judged by, right? Not, well, he's better than that, or she's better than that. But I think this is why, even the greatest talents out there, Steven Spielberg or Martin Scorsese or Aaron Sorkin, whoever, your movie or TV heroes are, any one of them is still capable of failing, because this is hard. It should be hard. If it's not hard, you're doing it wrong. It is always hard. It's never going to get easy for anybody, because storytelling, while the rules in my mind are quite simple, the content is so complex and infinite in its variations that if you're doing it right and paying attention and fully engaged in what you're doing, you can never sit back. You always have to be, fully present as a human being in order to capture whatever it is you have to say. And I know how much movies and TV meant to me as a child, and still mean to me. And I want to be one of those storytellers who gives that to somebody else. And that's not easy.
Frank, we've been talking.
Can I just say, you've given it to us, Frank?
Oh,
in it, I think I can speak for all of us there. Yeah. So thanks.
Thank you.
Frank, we've been talking a lot about structure, drama, story. Do you mind, I guess, sharing some thoughts on, character development? And do sometimes stories start with characters rather than, the plot, as an example?
Yes. And I think for me, early in my career, I was much stronger on plot and felt much more confident with plot. And I think a lot of TV writers are that way. But, that's more the craft part of it, and the art part of it, the character, the human emotion, the human truth is the more important part. But, if in a perfectly realized story, character and plot are like this, they're so enmeshed, you couldn't possibly pull them apart. You've picked the exact right obstacles and antagonists, for the character you've designed. And that character is so specific and unique that, only you could have imagined that person. Or if you're writing, on somebody else's show that somebody else has created it, you are so faithful to the core of that person. You've understood that person and loved them so much, that you are being truthful to the complexities of their character. That's why the X-Files episode Milagro is one of my favorite episodes, because I realized I had spent more time thinking about Mulder and Scully than any real person in my life, the previous 6 years. They'd become so real to me that I had fallen in love with these imaginary people. And that's what that episode is really about. So, when you're dreaming up a character, you have to love them. Even if they're bad guys, even if they're, anti-heroes or whatever, you have to love them. There's a cliche, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. And it's really true. If you don't, I can guarantee you nobody else is going to either. They might not love them in any case, but they're certainly not going to love them if you don't. You can't fake this stuff. And the more specific and moved you are by who those characters are, the more likely they are to reach other people. And then you need to design the story that fits them like a glove.
So, like literally, you got this opportunity to write on the X-Files. Were you just watching the X-Files like crazy and breaking it down and watching it over and over, like to get the essence of the characters?
I had watched, I had known Chris Carter years before. We'd been in a book group before. And I turned on the TV on a Friday night, not knowing he created a show called The X-Files. I was really surprised. And so, yes, I watched every episode. And when I came in to pitch, I was really prepared. But I think what I had done is, I loved it. And I really got the core of it. And I remember the first lunch I had with Chris and Howard Gordon at the commissary on the Fox lot. He's asking me for story ideas. And I said, well, what if a woman came back saying she was Mulder's sister? And I could see Chris's eyes go wide. And I could see I'd hit the mark, and that's the kind of, for whatever reason, that was the kind of identification I felt with the show, from the day I got there.
And over time, as you're spending more and more time with Mulder, Scully, and the other characters, you're saying well, I guess you knew them even better. Is that how that kind of evolution works?
Yeah. You just spend so much time, and you argue about them in the writer's room too. No, she wouldn't do that. No, she wouldn't. And, he would say this, he wouldn't say that, and it gets back to this thing about intuition again. It's like, initially you're not really sure why you're saying he or she wouldn't do or say that. But then you have an argument with another writer, and you kind of have to explain yourself and the logic behind it. It makes you externalize your intuition, and then it becomes something you're consciously aware of. And over the course of years, it becomes quite a body of knowledge you have, an understanding of these people, which makes it easier in some ways, but never easy, because the longer a show goes on, the harder it becomes not to repeat yourself and to find fresh ideas and fresh territory to explore.
Probably impossible for you to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is there a preference then to writing for characters that either exist? And I know you write a lot of characters about like real life characters and history characters, or coming up with a completely new character.
No, what's interesting is that writing about historical characters, I was so surprised anybody asked me to do that. Why are you thinking of me for historical drama? I'd never done anything like it before Medici. But I realized, it's kind of, this gets to AJ's question. It's kind of not unlike science fiction, or the supernatural storytelling, where you kind of have to know, why are you telling a story about these real people? Why are you telling a story about Cosimo de' Medici or about Leonardo da Vinci? What's your point? What's your angle? You're not going to have enough time or space to tell everything about their lives. You're going to have to find the lens, the filter through which you're approaching this person's life. So you have to know what it is about them that moves you, that is interesting to you. And then that helps you construct your story. So, that's a really interesting challenge. And you do get, really moved by these people, and they become real to you, your interpretation of them. So I enjoyed both.
That actually really resonates in doing documentaries and stuff in the past. I was given the advice once, you're not writing a Wikipedia page, you're telling a story. And so even in documentaries and nonfiction, it's it's the story element.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Any final questions, really across the board on any topics from Colleen, Molly, or AJ, as we're getting close to the end?
I would love, oh, go ahead, Colin. Go ahead.
Molly, you go first.
Oh,
Yeah, Molly,
we're all so polite and lovely. Frank, I would love to know. So well, everything, but I find when I write that I'd like to know if you control your diet of reading and watching while you're writing certain things, because I find this really hard, because I think, like everyone here, my love of writing comes from love of reading and watching, and the thought of restricting my reading diet I get very cross at, and I kind of rebel against myself. But I can really feel in myself the way, and it's not as simplistic as like plagiarism, and if I'm reading a certain type of book, my voice will start skewing that way. It's more like I know I find certain things like energizing or draining, but it can really take me, like I'm really thick, like I can read a whole book and realize, like, that whole time I've been reading it, I've just found it, maybe there's something in it that is too similar to what I'm writing, or that is different, and it kind of sucks me away, or gives me a total crisis of confidence. And then there's some other things, like William Gibson, weirdly, like his books are very different to mine, but if I ever read one of his books while I'm writing my book, it like acts like a battery. I don't know if it's just because of the exuberance of his imagination, or the pace, or something that chimes in just the right, similar but different way. It really encourages. So I'd be really interested. Do you go on like lockdown when you're working on a project? Do you only let yourself, like if you were writing Medici, were you only allowing, like, trying to absorb yourself in literature of the period? Are you strategic or not?
Well, I'm always working. I really am. I rarely take even a day off. I'm always, even if I'm on vacation, I'm working, in the morning. For years, I really couldn't watch TV. Like when I was doing X-Files, I didn't watch any TV, and it was terrible because, there are great shows on, but I couldn't watch it because it was the last thing I wanted to do when I got home after 10 or 12 hours working on a story, was watch an episodic drama. And I have to say, even now, most TV shows kind of feel like homework to me. It's really hard for me to disengage my analytical mind, to just be a viewer and enjoy. And when that happens, I absolutely love it. But I'm really tough. So I tend to watch documentaries or movies or comedies because it feels like a relief for my mind. I have made a great effort the last several years to watch more drama, because there's so much drama out there and so much good drama, but it's a conscious effort. And then I absolutely love reading books. And that's another thing that I've done a lot more of in recent years. I've made a point of doing that because it is fuel. It is, especially when it's of no direct use to you, especially when you're like, this will never be in a TV show, but it's enriching my life. It's enriching me in some way. And I love reading books when I realized by page 20, this could never be a TV show or a movie. It's like, oh, good, I'm off the hook. I could just read like Jennifer Egan's books or something. It's like, those are not, in my mind, screen narratives, but kind of deliberately. And that's like, whew, I can just enjoy this as a reader.
AJ, last question.
So, I think there'll be a lot of people watching this who are really energized by everything you said, Frank, and a lot of the other brilliant questions that everyone here has asked. But there's so many people who I notice, and I can think of people I've worked with before, who feel a real sense of lack of confidence about wanting to put themselves out there. They feel like they want to say something, they feel like they've got a story in them, but they don't feel they're good enough, or they don't feel they've got the ability. And as you said, the craft takes years, and you get better at it as you go. And you yourself, I'm sure you feel you're still learning as you go as well. And I think we all are. But what would you say to those people who are worried that they're not going to be good enough? Because I always, in my very limited experience and frame, I would always say to people, give it a go. But how do you feel about that? What would you say to those people?
Oh yeah, I mean, hey, that was me. I didn't feel I was good enough, and I ran away. I went and did something else for 7 years because I was so afraid of trying to do this and afraid of failing and afraid I wasn't going to be smart enough or, talented enough to compete with all the people in this multi-billion-dollar industry. Especially if you don't grow up in a place like Los Angeles. Coming from Phoenix, Arizona, I thought, people don't do this for a living. It just seemed like a mad idea. But being a writer is like an act of faith in yourself. And of course, you're not going to be very good in the beginning. I mean, almost nobody is very good in the beginning. That's freakish. That's 1 in 10 million if you're actually really good when you start. When you start out to be a writer, it's because I want to be a good writer, because I love movies or TV or books, whatever the discipline is that you're choosing to undertake. And so you're saying, I'm going to embark on this road, and I love it so much that I'm going to stick with it until I get good. And you're absolutely right, AJ. Like that journey never ends. That journey, hopefully, stays with you your entire life as a writer. You never stop trying to improve and get better. And you'll find out, do it. You'll find out if you love it enough, after 2 years or 5 years or, however long it takes for you to get your break. And some people will go, I did it for years. I don't love it enough. And I'm going to stop. Well, good. You found that out about yourself. And the other people will realize I do love it, and they do get their break, and it happens. And, I said this before, I really believe most of this is about hard work. Most of this is perseverance. Hopefully you have talent, but whatever talent you have, if you keep working on it, if you keep polishing it and shining it, it'll seem bigger and brighter over time. You look at a genius like Alfred Hitchcock, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, right? Absolutely amazing. But he was good at pretty much one thing. Now, I don't care that he couldn't do musicals or light comedy. I don't think about what Alfred Hitchcock couldn't do. I just think about what he could do. And that was changed cinema storytelling forever. So don't worry if you don't think you can, write the best dialogue or be the funniest lines, or, you will find what you're good at if you stick with it.
I think that's amazing advice. And hopefully everyone can take that away and try it out and find themselves a little bit. Colleen, do you have one final question for Frank as well? I don't want to leave you out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just knowing that so many people here are probably aspiring writers or have scripts and are hoping to get their break, you're in the position of being a showrunner. When you have a show and you're looking to staff, what kinds of things do you look for? 1, in the writing samples, and then 2, in the writers themselves?
So the way it works is that I will have written a pilot episode for something that has been picked up by a broadcaster. And then we'll contact all the agents in whatever town I'm, looking for writers in, whether it's, London, LA, New York, whatever. And then they'll submit writers who are interested in writing on that show. And then we'll read the scripts, and the scripts where I like the writing. I was engaged. I thought they were visual. I used to read scripts to support myself when I was in film school, and it was so painful reading most scripts that I became really grateful for scripts that I actually enjoyed reading, which was not most. So of the scripts where I really enjoyed the writing, that I asked to then meet with those writers. And I want to talk about the pilot episode with them. And what I've learned is you need to find the writers who don't just want a job, they want this job. And I've been fooled, not that many times, but a couple times in my career. It's like, you hire the writer and you realize, actually, they don't really like this show. This isn't really what they want to do. And that's a mistake for them and for you. So I'm trying to find those writers who really do have a passion for this and who have been attentive readers of the pilot and have interesting things to say about it. They don't have to say, everything's perfect about it. If they find something that could be improved or is wrong with it, and I agree, then I'm delighted, that they're helping me make it better. But I'm looking for people who really want to do this, with me, and who in the room are going to be really deep and committed collaborators. And then when you find those people, it's fun. It's really fun. Like you have that sense of time passing and you're not aware of it, which I think that's what we all want out of life. We want experiences, it can be writing, it can be scuba diving, sex, it can be what a great movie, whatever it is, but you want those experiences where you're so involved in whatever it is that's happening, you're not even aware time has passed. And, on my best days in a writer's room, that's what it's like.
That sounds incredible. Frank, thank you so much for all of your advice and your stories and your experiences. And thank you to Colleen and Molly and AJ as well for your experiences and asking such wonderful questions. If anyone watching is interested in checking out more of Frank's work, you could check out the historical drama Leonardo. The series recounts Leonardo da Vinci's life works and reveals the inner torments of a man obsessed with attaining perfection. If you're in Italy, it's on Rai 1. In the UK, it's on Amazon Prime. I think in the US now it's on the CW. And then recently it was announced that Frank's Big Light Productions will also be making a high-end drama series about events surrounding the Nuremberg trials. It'll follow the persecution of Nazi officials after World War II. Prosecution. And it's the first time in history that people were held accountable for war crimes, and it'll explore characters from all sides of the trials. And if you're a member of the Companion, we have an exciting lineup of conversations. So check your inboxes for the releases. We have George Takei, John Delancey, all coming up soon. And next weekend, we're hosting another very powerful roundtable discussion around the wisdom of George Takei. And we'll be exploring some themes around racism, life and death, and those kind of deep philosophies as well. So great. Thanks everyone for joining, and hope you all get writing.
Thank you all. Thanks, Lawrence. Thank you. Thanks everybody else. It was
Thank you, Frank.
Good to be here.
Thank you.